Hello everyone. Been a long time since I did a video, so here's a quick one, which is about Serde default values. Now, if you're like me, you've probably succumbed to using Claude for certain coding challenges, and I did that, but I don't like Claude doing code without me fully unpicking it. So here we've got, I don't know if, let me change this to dark. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. So when you're using Serde, you can have defaults. You could pass in constants, which is my question. Why use this thing here, and why not just use a constant? The upshot is it's part of the API for Serde. So yeah, video over. Bye. Thanks for watching. The solution really is to write a simple function that you can then use. So you could use the Serde with default, which will use the type's default trait. So if it's numeric, it'll be a 0, or if it's string, it would be a pair of quotes. So the problem is that the default would give you a 0 in this case, or the limit equals 0, whereas you probably actually want a value. So rather than having a default, you actually need to create something called default limit, which acts like a constant, but it's not a constant because of Serde's API design. So let's actually look at an example. Here's a practical example of the MCP server using Quadrant. What we've got here is default limit, and then that finds its way back up to here. So a bit like you have function names without the brackets in roots on Actix Web or Actix Web or in Axum, for instance. So here it's the function, but when you actually pass it into Serde, you don't have the parentheses, you just have quotes around the name. And again, default with payload goes up there. But you see here you've got 10 is a kind of a sane default limit. You wouldn't want a default limit of 0 because you could end up, if you were doing a retrieval from a database, for instance, that means there's no limit. So this allows clients to send minimal JSON. So there you see, limit equals 10, which has come from the default limit parentheses function, which is what we did here. So fn, then you create a function name with parentheses, no parameters inside, and then you return whatever the type is. So in this case, it was U64 because that's what we were using for the type for our limit key, and 10. It does talk about, again, this was my query to Claude about why it did it, and then it was saying if you wanted, you could use constants. So that's quite neat. You've got the hybrid approach. It's not really hybrid makes it sound like a compromise, but really it's not a compromise. What it's doing is just setting some constants here, and then you're using those constants as the return values of these functions, which you then use as the defaults with this Serde macro here. Whether I would choose to use this without sort of giving it a lot of thought, I don't know, but it makes perfect sense. And I think that's always the first step, is make sure you 100% understand it, revisit it. What was the Feynman technique? Recall. So repetition and recall. So revisit this, understand it today, come back in a week's time, revisit it, maybe do it a third time. There's it's inversely proportional to your forgetfulness. So if you learn something once, you recall, to forget, yeah, is it about 20%? But after the second time, that almost plateaus out. So by the time you've learned something the third time, your retention of that is quite good. So I would always say revisit things twice, which I will try and do on this as well. So just remember that Serde using default may not always be optimal for what you're doing with your code. You may need to make a function that returns a more suitable, sensible default. Yeah, sensible defaults instead of naught or false. Keep it simple. Inline functions usually best. Only extract constants if you need the value elsewhere in your code. So yeah, if you're using it multiple places, then it's obviously worth having a constant. This pattern makes your API more ergonomic by allowing clients to omit optional fields while still getting reasonable default values. So I don't optional. I didn't notice any of these being optional fields, but I'll revisit. I'll have to go away and think about that. None of these were optional, but that's probably something to go and test. Does it actually panic if any of these values? That won't panic if it's missing. Oh, okay, yeah. So it's like it's almost turning it into an option. Right. Need to go and test that. I think it saves you. It looks like it saves you having to have an option. So rather than having to have an option of U64 there, you can actually have your an attribute, a Serde attribute macro thing there. Okay, that's nice. So rather than having options, because obviously if you have an option, then you need to extract that sum or none, or process it as a some value, and then do something with it, or deal with it if it's none. But there we go. That's interesting. I'm going to go away and practice that. But I just thought this was interesting. Serde default values, why functions instead of constants, and also why functions instead of defaults. Anyway, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon.